Germany was a set of disparate states for nearly 1,000 years before it unified to become a superpower that unleashed a world war and then a European-wide project of unity. To see how this happened, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Germany. It's been a long time since humans have lived in Germany. The earliest evidence comes from Schöningen in Lower Saxony, where a set of wooden spears were found that date from some 300,000 years ago. In more recent times, possibly driven by climate change, a little less than 3,000 years ago, the first Germanic-speaking tribes came to the area from Scandinavia. They spread rapidly, and by 2,000 years ago, they controlled all the territory north of the Danube, dividing themselves into distinct tribes. A different people, the Celts, were concentrated in southern Germany, seemingly coexisting and gradually adopting Germanic culture. The Germanic tribes were dominated by chiefs and had a complex mythology dominated by the Aesir, war deities like Odin, and Vanir, gods of fertility like Nor. They had complex alliances between each other and were buried with jewelry and fine weapons. Around the late 2nd century BCE, they came into contact with the Romans, a group they would soon be in conflict with, starting with the Cimbrian War in 113 BCE, where Rome ended up victorious. In 12 BCE, Augustus became the first Roman emperor to launch a campaign across the Danube. These efforts were initially successful as the Romans were able to create the province of Germania Antiqua with the lands they conquered. Unfortunately for them, as they pushed further north and east so as to create a Magna Germania province, the Romans were defeated by an alliance of Germanic tribes led by Arminius at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest near modern-day Kalkriese. A key turning point in human history, the massive defeat convinced the Romans to give up on conquest and instead opted to build fortified garrisons alongside both the Danube and Rhine. Despite the fortifications, a porous border developed where free trade and travel flourished. Roman money and farming techniques began to be used by Germanic society, while some of the men served in the Roman armies, and a form of literacy developed, especially after Ulfilas, a preacher of Greek descent, invented a Gothic alphabet he used to translate the Bible to convert the Goths around 369 AD. The Goths were one of the two main confederations of Germanic peoples that had developed by this time. They were concentrated around the Danube. The other large confederation was the Alemanni, who clustered around the Rhine. The uneasy stability that had developed in the region was thrown into disarray around the late 4th century when a mounted nomadic non-Germanic people, known as the Huns, arrived from the east. This, along with other factors including climate change and population increases, prompted the easternmost Germanic peoples, the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, to head west into Central Europe and the Roman Empire. Soon they would be joined by other Germanic peoples including the Suebi, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, and so on, who would fight and pillage their way into the control of other areas in Europe as the overstretched Roman Empire slowly fell apart. Meanwhile, within modern German territory, the Frisians, Alemanni, Thuringians, Bavarians, and Franks emerged from an assortment of different tribes that clubbed together to defend themselves against the Huns. Others, like the Wends, a Slavic people from the east, would move in and replace some of the local tribes in what is now eastern Germany. The strongest of these groups ended up being the Franks, who began expanding south and east during the reign of Clovis in 482 AD, the monarch that would establish a dynasty that would last 250 years, the Merovingians. In 751, a new leader, Charles Martel, established a fresh ruling line, the Carolingian dynasty, whose most famous monarch, Charlemagne, made his capital in what is now Germany's westernmost city, Aachen. The Franks brought Christianity with them, most famously through the missionary work of people like St. Boniface, an English-born monk who helped integrate much of Germany into the Frankish Christian Church until he found martyrdom in Frisia in 754. The other things the Franks forged was an administrative state that allowed some autonomy to the indigenous leaders, which in turn helped it expand. By the time of Charlemagne's death in 814, the Franks controlled not just most of what is now Germany, but also France, much of Italy and northern chunks of Spain, what would later be referred to as the Holy Roman Empire. When Charlemagne died, however, the Treaty of Verdun divided their realm into three parts in 843. Its eastern side, or East Francia, covered much of what is now Germany and was initially governed by Louis the German, Charlemagne's grandson. Almost immediately, it assumed a distinct identity bolstered by Louis's cultivation of the German language and literature, which included the translation of the Gospels. This helped the realm hold together, but then Louis's great-grandson, known as the Kid, died without an heir, and the Carolingian dynasty died out. To replace him, the local nobles chose the Duke of Saxony, Henry the Fowler, as king, the first non-Frankish monarch in 919. His son, Otto I, would use strategic marriages and gifts to church leaders to expand his royal powers, creating new nobles that answered directly to him. Even better for his prestige, Otto managed to stop a threat that had loomed over the region for over a century when he defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, a victory that put an end to the Hungarian invasions of Western Europe. He then also conquered the Kingdom of Italy in 961, which led to the Pope crowning him as emperor, further revitalizing the Holy Roman Empire. Barely 6 decades later, however, 2 consecutive kings, Otto III, grandson of the original Otto, and Henry II, a duke from Bavaria, died without heirs, leading to a fresh royal line when Conrad II was crowned in March of 1027. The new dynasty, the Stalians, came from Franconia and would rule the empire for a century but faced deep financial problems, not least because of the many Saxon gifts to the church, as well as an increasing challenge from territorial princes. Even worse, Pope Gregory VII initiated an effort to demarcate a clear church independence, which challenged the right of the state to choose and install bishops, the so-called investiture controversy in 1076. Emperor Henry IV tried to hold the line, but ended up excommunicated twice, and then the following year literally had to beg for forgiveness on his knees while a blizzard raged in what came to be known as the Walk to Canossa. The controversy over bishop control would eventually end with the Concordat of Worms in 1122, but not the troubles for the Salian dynasty, as the ruling line died without an heir just 3 years later. What followed was a civil war between the Swabian Hohenstaufens and the Saxon Welfs, until the 2 dynasties were united by marriage and Frederick Barbarossa, or Redbeard, was elected to the throne in 1152. A mythical king that would later be the subject of multiple legends, not least because he spent most of his time conquering Italy. Redbeard nonetheless eroded Germany's central authority, given that his frequent absences increased the power of bishops and princes. Having seen a gain in status, the new elites preferred not to elect a strong king who might threaten their growing independence, so for the next 100 years, a trend of selecting weaker monarchs developed. This eventually led to the Great Interregnum in 1250, a period of chaos in which there was effectively no central power, as different factions fought with each other over who the rightful emperor should be, a dispute that would last nearly a century. This finally ended first with the Declaration of Rennes in 1338, which established an election by majority vote, and then definitively with the Golden Bull of 1356, a basic constitutional document that fixed the electoral body at 7. A new royal house ended up ruling the empire during this time, the Luxembourgs, who managed to keep the throne for some 150 years, while simultaneously presiding over the development of city leagues. These were mutual assistance alliances that had not just military, but also commercial components and would become powerful autonomous secular centers, including the Swabian, Rhenish, Lusatian, and Hanseatic leagues. The latter was particularly important because it would bring prosperity to northern German towns and would control much of the commerce in northern Europe for some 200 years. The Luxembourgs gave way to a new dynasty, the Habsburgs, when marriage between the 2 lines placed Albert II in the imperial throne in 1438. The Habsburgs, a set of nobles originally from the Duchy of Swabia, would eventually become Austria's royal line, and with Albert would usher in a dynasty that would rule the Holy Roman Empire for the next 3 centuries. Initially, the Habsburgs shored up their power with ambitious marriage alliances, expanding out from Austria to include the Netherlands, much of Italy, Spain and its New World colonies, Bohemia, and Hungary. They also brought much-needed reform of the imperial government, in part because of the constant warfare it engaged in, as it tried to maintain the integrity of its territories. A legislative assembly met at Worms in 1495, which moved to institutionalize laws, created a supreme imperial chamber court, and imposed a new imperial tax. Even though territorial rulers and city magistrates held much of the real power on the ground, the centralized bureaucratic expansion, increasingly extravagant courts, larger armies, incessant war, and a grasping corrupt church all served to increase the financial burden at every level of society. Economic resentment was inevitable. Thus, when a monk from Eisleben, Martin Luther, objected to the profligacy of the church by outlining its abuses in his 95 Theses and stapling them to the castle church in Wittenberg in 1517, he struck a chord with people. Luther's most radical claim, his challenge to papal authority as the sole interpreter of the Bible, earned him a call to explain himself before the Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Worms in 1521. Fortunately for him, his ideas had quickly spread thanks to a crucial new invention, the movable type printing press, which a German craftsman, Johannes Gutenberg, had put to commercial use in Mainz in 1452. Even better, it soon became clear that any ruler who adopted his ideas and refused to recognize the authority of the Pope could expect to make huge gains in power and wealth by taking ownership of the church within their state. Thus, not surprisingly, Luther not only became a German hero and was able to escape prison or worse, but also saw the development of Protestantism, a new religious creed based on Lutheranism that rapidly spread through Europe. By the 1520s, there were several towns and states that had formally turned Lutheran, and by 1530, an official statement of the Lutheran faith, the Augsburg Confession, was adopted. The Reformation, as this movement came to be known, was in full swing. Then, by 1545, there was the Counter-Reformation begun at the Council of Trent, where a number of canonical matters were clarified and a list of heresies outlined. On the one hand, this would lead to much preoccupation with religion in German society and lead to the compositions of Johann Sebastian Bach and building of new churches like Frankfurt's Cathedral. But on the other, it would pave the way for serious religious conflict and wars that would rock Europe for the next few centuries. The most immediate of these was the German Peasants' War in 1524, a widespread insurgency that had both economic and religious motivations. It was crushed within a year by the empire's troops, however, and there was a massive slaughter of hundreds of thousands of peasants, as well as a religious leader, Thomas Munzit, who was tortured, beheaded, and had his head put on a spike in Mühlhausen. Then there was the Schmalkaldic War in 1546, and most important of all, the 30 Years' War in 1618, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history, which was fought disproportionately in German territory, but pitted a wide array of alliances beyond it, mainly against the Spanish Habsburgs and their Catholic allies. Given the destruction, there were also multiple attempts at peace. The most significant were the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 and Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The latter would hammer out the principle that religion could not be something that external rulers had the right to impose on people, and set a cornerstone of the international system known as Westphalian sovereignty, the idea that states have exclusive supremacy within their own territory. The Westphalian Treaty also severely diminished the power of the Holy Roman Emperor, making the former empire a collection of hundreds of fiefdoms, sometimes with absolutist petty rulers, and terrible conditions for most people. Its most notable exception was Brandenburg, Prussia. Ruled by the House of Hohenzollern, and with its capital in Berlin, it had a meteoric rise in the next few centuries by combining tolerance and militarism. The religious refuge they offered attracted skilled Jews, Huguenots, Dutch colonists, and German Catholics, and made it a mercantile power, while its emphasis on Spartan discipline in society, first begun under Frederick I, soon allowed it to amass the fourth largest army in Europe. The following king, Frederick the Great, added a degree of sophistication, encouraging learning and culture, abolishing torture, and reducing taxes on the poor. Even better, when Prussia then put its military to use, it promptly started gaining territory, mostly at the expense of the Archduchy of Austria in 1748, which was then reaffirmed with another Prussian victory at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, even while both were still technically part of the Holy Roman Empire. The intellectual response to the region's absolutism was an attempt to move away from empiricism and rationalism. This was best exemplified by the treatises of Immanuel Kant, who looked to establish a foundation of ethics and aesthetics, as well as the literary works of Johann Wolfgang Goethe, widely considered the greatest writer in the German language. Meanwhile, the rise of Napoleon in France, his subsequent conquest of many a Germanic principality, and Austria's catastrophic defeats against him in the War of the Third Coalition finally put an end to what had been a long-declining Holy Roman Empire, leading to its official dissolution on August 6, 1806. Just a few months later, Napoleon also managed to defeat Prussia, capturing Berlin on October 24th and forcing Frederick to give up about half of its territories. Once in control, Napoleon began to reorganize German lands into client states, forcing them, with the exception of Austria and Prussia, into a confederation. He also introduced state reform, streamlining ministries, encouraging trade, and making guild membership more accessible, which unwittingly put Germany on a path to centralize, strengthen, and nation-build. Indeed, after Prussia and its allies defeated Napoleon for the last time at Waterloo in June 1815, European powers agreed to create a German confederation that same year at the Congress of Vienna. This was a loose association of 39 predominantly German-speaking states over which an Austrian representative presided. Despite its complexity, relative weakness, and lack of executive, the fact that it could never be legally dissolved and that federal law was binding on its members strengthened German unification. At the same time, liberalism and nationalism expanded in German society during this period. The southern German states wrote constitutions, students developed Burschenschaften, that is, fraternities that advocated for a liberal and unified Germany, and there were even a number of uprisings demanding change, most notably the failed revolutions of 1848. The ultimate driver of unity, however, was Prussia. In 1834, it forged an economic union known as Zollverein that would include most German states by 1866. Then, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, its foreign minister and a member of the landed gentry, Prussia went to war over territorial disputes in 1865 and 1866 with Denmark and Austria respectively. This led to further Prussian expansion and then to the creation of a northern German confederacy the same year. Then, just a few years later, yet another war, this time with France, a victorious Prussia that not only captured the French Emperor Napoleon III, but also briefly occupied Paris, convincing the southern German states to join the Confederacy. German unification became official at a ceremony in the Hall of Mirrors in Paris on January 18, 1871, where the Confederacy changed its name to Empire, proclaimed Emperor the Prussian King Wilhelm, and made Bismarck its first chancellor. In the nearly 5 decades that followed, the German Empire became an industrial, technological, and scientific power in Europe. By 1913, it was not just the biggest economy in continental Europe and the third largest in the world, but had the world's strongest army, second navy, and third largest empire in the world. Massive industry changed a mostly rural country into an urban one, and Bismarck's vision created the world's first welfare state, providing pensions, health, and unemployment insurance. Unfortunately for the country, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, in June 1914 prompted Germany's entry into World War I through a series of entangling alliances that, contrary to expectations, lasted 4 years rather than a few months. Although the war was mostly not fought in German territory, the country ended up fighting a two-front war, lost 1.7 million people, faced famine, and at the end, discontent was so widespread that Emperor Wilhelm was forced to abdicate, and Germany became a republic. Later named Weimar after the place where its constitution, hailed as the most democratic and liberal in the world at the time, was adopted. Things did not go well for the Weimar Republic. It was forced to pay a gigantic reparations bill, some 132 billion gold marks, which it had trouble doing given its post-war economy. Even worse, it basically printed money to cover its debts, which by 1923 unleashed hyperinflation. And then the Great Depression hit, bringing even more economic collapse. With so many problems, political instability and extremism was the order of the day. The latter was dominated by two main groups, the Communists and National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as Nazis, both of which created street gangs who would often come to blows. The fear of anarchy increased the support for the Nazis, and their leader, Adolf Hitler, a war veteran who blamed the problems on Jews and promised to restore national pride. In the 1932 parliamentary elections, the Nazis took 37% of the vote, making them the largest party in the Reichstag, or parliament, while the Communists took 15%. Nazi thugs began attacking Jewish shops and businesses and intimidating liberals into muted criticism or silence. But what eventually brought the Nazis to power in 1933 was infighting among conservatives, who persuaded the virtually senile president and former Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg to make Hitler chancellor. This move was based on a gamble that the Nazis would crush the left, but failed to form an effective government, so that within a few months Hitler could be nudged aside. Instead, the Nazis used an arson attack on the Reichstag as an excuse to pass an emergency decree, which they used to pass the Enabling Act in March of that year, which basically gave Hitler dictatorial powers. What he did with that was install a brutal regime that not only set out to systematically exterminate what he considered inferior races, including Jews, Roma, gay people, and so on, but also an extremely aggressive foreign policy known as Lebensraum, or living space, that sought to annex its neighbors to create a greater Germany. This in turn brought about World War II in September 1939. At first, the war was a wild success for the Nazis. By late 1942, Germany or its allies controlled all of Europe with the exception of the UK and had opted to invade the Soviet Union. But then, starting with the Battle of Stalingrad, the tide began to turn. And then in June 1944, the Allies managed to land in Normandy, and soon Germany found itself fighting a two-front battle once again. By April 1945, the situation was so desperate, Hitler killed himself, leading to the unconditional Nazi surrender on May 7th. The end of the war brought occupation and then partition. Germany became ground zero in the Cold War that developed between the capitalist side, led by the US, and the communist side, led by the USSR, with not only Germany itself divided into two countries, but also its capital. Indeed, Berlin became a physical symbol of the conflict when a wall was built to prevent people on the communist side from escaping to the west. This got worse as West Germany prospered in the post-war years while East Germany languished. And while the East Germans had to worry about authoritarianism and the Stasi, or German police, the West Germans were busy creating common markets with France and what would eventually become the European Union. Relations between the two Germanys got better in the 1970s when they signed the Basic Treaty, which committed them to respect each other's frontiers. But then the Soviet Union's leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, decided to bring reforms known as glasnost and perestroika, which eased authoritarianism. This, however, had the unintended consequences of weakening the various communist regimes. East Germany was among these, and it soon collapsed through a series of peaceful protests that eventually led to the opening of the border, and then, most famously, the destruction of the Berlin Wall starting on November 9, 1989. This process, which the Germans called Die Wende, or turn, also brought about the reunification of the two Germanys, culminating on October 3, 1990. Since then, Germany has grown in uneven fits and starts, doing just enough to maintain itself as one of the richest countries in Europe, but without dealing with some of the underlying structural problems, not least the heavy economic cost of reunification. This was best exemplified by Angela Merkel's leadership, which lasted 16 years as chancellor and dealt with multiple crises, often by simply postponing them. The seeming inability to solve these problems have hurt the traditional parties like the SPD and CDU-CSU and given rise to the AfD, or Alternative for Germany, a hard-right outfit who blames a lot of the German problems on immigration. Nervous of putting an extreme right party in charge because of its Nazi past, the rest of the political establishment has a policy of not working with them on legislation, which to some extent has only made the AfD more popular and seems like it will run Germany in the near future. As a result, Germany seemingly finds itself at another crossroads. Wherever it goes, it will have huge global implications.